Later on, Quakers became quite well known for their attempt at reforming the prison system. Not always well done. Their model for prison reform was solitary confinement. If you know the 1829 Eastern State Penitentiary, you can still visit up there in Philadelphia. But the model was, not dungeons and stocks and punishment, but reform. And with that belief in the inward light, if we confine these people to a cell with some reading material, a little garden, some nature, and visits by good Quakers and upright folk, then inward light will lead them into truth and reform. It didn't work quite how they wanted, but again, the intent was to reform the kind of prison system they had all suffered under. And then, if I can read my own writing, one of the interesting pieces, again, as they react to the nature of politics in Europe, Penn said, "Neither I nor my heirs can presume to override the law. Just because we were given this colony, just because we were here in authority, doesn't give us any different rights than others have under the law." Then later on, the Constitution of Rhode Island institutes many of these same sorts of understandings. And it was the Constitution of Rhode Island, which had been under the leadership of Quakers for 36 terms. Stephen Hopkins, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, was governor of Rhode Island. The Rhode Island Constitution was the model for the Bill of Rights. That, again, guarantees our freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. There were two Quakers, both of them having been disowned, but Quaker-raised signers of the Declaration of Independence, Joseph Hughes and Stephen Hopkins. And if you're familiar with the Turnbull picture of the signers of the Declaration, you can pick out the Quaker. How do you pick out the Quaker?
Plain dress.
Got a hat on. That's Stephen Hopkins. Okay, so any questions there before I turn to some of the specifics that Yount talks about, real influence on Quaker culture? So any additions, corrections, questions at that point? Yeah.
Max, these did not necessarily originate with William Penn. They were gathered from earlier Quakers and other writings. Is that correct?
Yeah, and from the Iroquois nation. He was deeply influenced by how Iroquois gathered together, made decisions. He learned the Iroquois language. Back before he was very portly, all the pictures you see of him typically show him very portly, but he used to be very athletic. And he would participate in Iroquois games and races and things like that. But that became quite an iconic understanding that Quakers had of our relations with Native Americans. You know what? They were not savages to Quakers. They had that light within. And in frontier wars, the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, there were Quakers on the Pennsylvania frontier who would literally leave their latch strings out. The only way to really secure your front door, that leather latch string, because they knew that the Native Americans and the Quakers had good relations. And I've read documents of Native Americans giving witness at later federal treaties that Quakers would go to try to assure that the federal government didn't cheat them, of saying, I was on a raiding party and we came to a Quaker house, saw the latch string out and realized, they're Quakers, and passed by and then torched everything else in the neighborhood. So they learned a lot from Native Americans as well.
I was reading about the Tuscarora Wars here in North Carolina, and the Quakers kept voting against. sending in, supporting the army or militia to go in and wipe out the Indians. It's like, no.
Yeah, the understanding I have of the first Quaker settlers here in the Piedmont in the 1740s, 1750s was that they felt free to come here because the Tuscarora Wars had wiped out the area of Indian habitation. The Cherokees had gone west, Tuscarora went north, the Occaneechi, Saponi, Kiowa, Saura went elsewhere. It was only then that committee of New Garden meeting up in Chester County felt free to send folk down the old wagon road and settle here. And that carried on even into the early 1800s. I remember doing some research about the Quakers and Native Americans in the Midwest, that there was a wampum belt depicting William Penn and an Indian holding hands circulating in the Midwest as late as the 1800s. And that during the War of 1812, Quakers in Indiana also left the latch string out. And that, especially where my ancestors and a lot of Quakers from this area who went to Indiana in the early 1800s, settled in Orange County, southern Indiana, Paoli, Salem, that area. Just north of there was the famous Pigeon Roost Massacre, where whites were massacred by Native Americans at the beginning of the War of 1812. But the Quaker communities were spared because of that. There's the historian Clyde Milner III, whose book, With Good Intentions, talks about how in 1869, Ulysses S. Grant's, if I can mention Grant in the Southern gathering, Ulysses S. Grant's Seneca Indian advisor said, turn the Indian Department over to the Quakers. They can't do any worse. And indeed, the Western superintendencies, in large part, were handed over to Quakers, who then promptly built boarding schools. We can get into that as well. But Clyde Milner III talks about, with good intentions, how the Quakers sought to, follow up on that reputation, but got caught up in the same sort of attitudes of late 1800s. There were Indian boarding schools, Quaker Indian boarding schools here in North Carolina. At least two, I think, out in Cherokee. And I remember taking a group of Guilford students on spring break back in, I think it was 1992. We went down to the Qualla boundary and talking with one of their elders, Walker Calhoun, said his grandmother had gone to one of those Quaker boarding schools, and that as a little boy he remembered that she always kept a half lemon in the bathroom that he always assumed was her air freshener, but learned that she used that to try to lighten her skin. She'd been taught in the boarding school, whether she was taught or just picked up that whites are superior, lighter skin, but that's part of our heritage as well. Other questions there before we turn to some of the... Yeah?
The boarding schools here, did they have the reputations of the other ones, like the Carlisle Institute, for example?
No, there are no, as far as no cemeteries have been discovered where, mass burials of children, but they did follow the pattern of trying to change the culture. They had to speak English, had to dress English, but this was the pattern of New Garden Boarding School. I mean, this is what boarding schools did. When New Garden Boarding School, now Guilford College, was established in 1837, if you read the rules, they're trying to change the culture of these kids. They had to dress plain, had to use the plain speech. Members of the opposite sex couldn't get together except for a few hours in a parlor on first day afternoon if they could prove they were related. Well, that's easy for all Quakers. We're related to everyone. But again, it was to change the culture. And the fringe schools that I taught in Ramallah started as a boarding school in 1869. And it wasn't to convert. Ramallah was a Christian town. So they weren't going there to convert folk, but to share the Christian message in the educational format. They were all Greek Orthodox or Roman Catholic at the time. But they introduced what Midwestern Quakers like my great aunt Annis Carter, who was one of the missionary teachers, felt they ought to do. You know, no alcohol, no tobacco, very proper life, and it ruined a lot of marriages. You know, as the girls would come back from their boarding school and tell their husbands to be, okay, but the missionaries told me, no drinking, no smoking. Well, try to do that in Arab culture. So that pattern, existed. And one of the great examples of that you can read about is Gertrude Simmons at Kalasah, who was a Yankton Sioux woman out in the Dakotas, who was sent by a Quaker missionary to a Quaker boarding school, White's Institute in Wabash, Indiana, established after the Civil War for Indian children. And she writes about how she appreciated the education, the opportunity to do music. She was quite a musician. But how she missed her culture and how they tried to change her culture. But, she left for a year, went back to Red, but then went back to White's because she missed the advantages. And then went to Earlham and spent 4 years at Earlham. Same sort of thing. Appreciated the education, wasn't so appreciative of trying to change the culture. But again, that was the pattern of boarding schools. Yeah. But none of the excesses that I've come across. Now, the archives of Haverford College have records about those boarding schools because in the 1950s, some of their sociology students went down and kind of studied and did oral histories. And so if you're really interested in some of that, Haverford, should have some records. But there's a lot of Quaker writing now. A couple issues of Fringe Journal, the Quaker publication, have been dealing with that in the last 3 years of reassessing the Quaker boarding schools. Tunasasa was the famous one up in upstate New York, and there's several out in the superintendencies. Other questions there? Okay, well, following Young, I just want to look at some of what he sees as Quaker influences on broader American culture. We've already looked at, I think, two of the main ways that Quakers really have impacted, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, separation of church and state, soul liberty, especially. But Yount has a list of several things that he sees as having been influenced by Quakers. First off, certainly equality. And Quakers offered a corrective to Calvinism. The Puritans up in New England were all about, you were loathsome insects dangling by a slender thread over the very pits of hell, and nothing, Jonathan Edwards, you've probably all read it. Quakers didn't believe that. Quakers believed that we're born tabula rasa. Then society imprints on you, and so you need to be involved in the reform of society because you're born innocent. You're born tabula rasa, a blank slate. And that if you turn to that light in your conscience, that light in your reason, then you can become fully human, fully self-actualized. And there are other influences like that on American society. You just look at the back of your dollar bill. Eyes on the top of pyramids and all that kind of good stuff. A lot of mysticism and deism and Freemasonry in there as well. But there is a deep emphasis of Quakers on that soul liberty, on our being born in human equality. Everyone has that of God within them. And although you don't necessarily see that throughout founding the United States, we had slaves. Quakers had slaves. Mary Fisher, when she died in Charleston, South Carolina, in her will, there was an enslaved woman. But 1776, interestingly enough, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting adopts an anti-slavery testimony. Took a while. Quaker decision-making, but by 1776 in Philadelphia, you couldn't be Quaker and be involved in slavery. And in North Carolina by 1778, it took a while for all that to filter down here from the mother church in Philadelphia. But if you consider the fact that almost half the original American colonies were Quaker, there's a lot of that influence you had Rhode Island, Delaware, West Jersey, Pennsylvania, and of course the Carolinas. So there's significant impact. And Quakers were the 5th largest denomination up to the Revolutionary War. So huge influence, huge presence, and that diminished after the Revolutionary War for obvious reasons. We didn't fight for the most part. We'll talk about that if there's time. Nathaniel Greene, after Greensboro's name, and a few other Quakers, but deep influence there on the original colonies. Talk about informality. If you look at society in England, very formal, class society. Those above you, you give deference to, you bow, you curtsy, you take the hat off. In Old English, you refer to them as you, which is plural. Thee, thou, and thy were singular. That's what you do with equals and inferiors. And of course, Quakers just didn't abide by any of that. Wouldn't take their hats off to authority. There's a great story of George Cadbury, of the Cadbury chocolate fame, early 1900s. Quakers cornered the market on cocoa in England, 1800s. Fry's, Roundtree's, Cadbury's, Peak's, Freem's, Huntley's, Palmer's, Jacobs, Carr's, all those folk. For abstemious reasons, they'd gone abstemious. So alternatives to the alcoholic drinks, coffees, teas, and chocolates. Well, anyway, they made a lot of money off of cocoa. And George Cadbury and his wife were good friends of King George and his wife. And they were being hosted at one of the homes at one point. They came in from outside, and George Cadbury and King George had their hats on coming in from the outside. As they stepped inside the house, George Cadbury's wife, who was very proper Brit, said, "George, take off thy hat!" And the king very quickly took his hat off. But there's that understanding. You didn't take your hats off to anyone but God. In Quaker worship, you went into the meeting house with your hat and your bonnet on, and they remained on, because that's not sacred space. That's just a meeting house. You can worship God anywhere. But when someone rose or went to their knees to address God, the hats came off. Bonnets came off, because that's who you show authority to. Tolerance, especially of church and state, Catholics, Jews, again, that key understanding that Quakers had of that of God in everyone. And in fact, in the first theology written of Quakers by Robert Barclay, he very specifically states that because of that of God in everyone, that light that is in everyone, that even if one has never heard the name of Jesus, turning to that light will lead them into salvation, even if they've never heard the name of Jesus. And they would talk about some of the apocryphal stories of Muslims shipwrecked on a desert island, and found that they had followed all the tenets of the Quran. And he said, "How did? Well, I just was there. I just knew it." There are a lot of those sorts of stories, but again, pointing to that belief in tolerance of all and respect for all, and the belief that all had that light of God in them. Speech patterns. Now here, how many are familiar with Albion Seed? Fascinating look at 4 folkways that defined American culture, depending on where folk immigrated from in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. And the 4 folkways that deeply influenced American speech patterns and culture were the Royalists, think Virginia, the Puritans, those nonconformists, think New England, Boston, the Scots-Irish, who headed toward mountains because, freedom, independence, and authority, and the Quakers. The Quakers were one of the four major influences that the author of that Albion sees. And that has to do with speech patterns. I grew up in Indiana using old Elizabethan words and expressions because of those migratory patterns. I still refer to a light dusting of snow as a skift. Skift of snow. That's straight from over yonder. Simplicity of dress, speech, and even in construction, meeting houses, homes. Again, think back to European patterns and the wealth that was displayed in dress and in flowery speech and in construction. And Quakers simplified so much of that. Children and family life. Again, children were seen as having dad and God with them. They were kind of treated as young adults, and they were cared for. There's a famous story that Quakers often referred to, the Reading Friends meeting in 1650s, 1660s. All the adults had been arrested, thrown in prison because they were worshiping in a non-Church of England form. And so all the adults were sent to prison in Reading. The children continued meeting for worship. They kept meeting going until the adults were released. Marriage. David Yount maintains, and I don't know how you determine this, but he claims that Quaker marriage was really love-based. Now, a lot of European marriages were kind of dynastic or for political purposes, but Quakers emphasized marriage on the basis of love. Now, I don't know that Quaker wedding ceremonies have influenced American wedding culture much, because in the last 20 or 30 years that I've officiated as a recorded minister of weddings, I think the average price is about $25,000 of these, wedding venues and the photographers and the caterers and all of that rigmarole is what my great aunt would call falderall. But if you've ever been, how many of you have been to a Quaker wedding? I always told my students at Guilford, marry a Quaker or have a Quaker wedding, you'll get out really cheap. You go through the premarital counseling with the clearance committee. You announce your intentions to your meeting. They appoint a committee. We are Quakers after all. It's all committees. And they meet with you to make sure you're clear of previous marriages or current marriages. There are some records of those. And clear financially, clear spiritually. And then if you meet the criteria, then they report to a monthly meeting for business that you're clear, and they appoint a time for getting married and a committee to oversee the wedding. Now, back in the day, that was at the tail end of meeting for worship. You just married and meeting for worship, the way the Amish do it still today. But typically, it's especially called meeting for worship on the occasion of marriage. The couple walks in together, sit on the facing bench. At New Garden meeting, we've got a special little wedding bench, a little short little bench. It goes up front. And you settle into silence, simple worship, no officiant, in a traditional Quaker way. There are all kinds of variations on it. But then, when they just can't stand it anymore, the couple rise, take each other by the hand, probably shaking like crazy. In the presence of God, and these are family and friends, I take thee, Jenny, to be my wife, promise of divine assistance to be unto thee a loving and faithful husband, as long as we both shall live. And then she does the same thing without nervousness, taking me to be her wife or whatever. And just very simple vows. Did you sign a certificate? Because back in the day, when you had no ordained clergy, the way the state recognized the legality of it is by all the witnesses. And you have kind of your genealogy, who you are, where you're from, the meetings that you have oversight. and then your vows, and then the couple signs, and then everyone present signs. And going to most Quaker homes who had that wedding, it's on the wall. Where's yours?
On the wall.
On the wall. Ours is on our bedroom wall. It's reminding us of all those folk and little kids in big block letters, you know, and they're now 60 or 70. It's kind of neat. The archives at Guilford has all kinds of records of these going back hundreds of years. It's quite neat. So, marriage on the basis of love, simplicity, rooted in that community of faith. Education, again, Quakers valued education for a variety of reasons. One is we weren't allowed into church schools because we were nonconformists. And there wasn't a public school system. North Carolina got theirs, late 1800s, 1870s, 1880s. And you had no ordained clergy, so everyone needed to know how to read the Bible, how to read the story of your faith. And boys and girls needed to be educated because of that equality, spiritual equality and equality of authority. When Guilford College was established as a boarding school in 1837, it was co-ed. 25 boys, 25 girls, I think 4 female faculty, 3 male, something like that. Now, co-education back then meant something different, room by room in the dorm. Now, there was a girls' wing and a boys' wing and a girls' side of campus and a boys' side of campus, and never the twain should meet except for first day afternoons if you were related. But it was co-education because the value, the belief in that spiritual equality of all. And you take a look at the migratory patterns of Quakers across the United States. You start in Pennsylvania, you got Haverford, Swarthmore, and Bryn Mawr. You had to have more schools essentially than you had Quakers because of splits. Hicksites and Orthodox and Gurneyites and all that stuff. But then you come down the wagon road into the south and you got Guilford College. Then before the Civil War and especially after the Civil War up into Ohio and Indiana, the Free States, you've got Malone, Wilmington in Ohio, Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana. Then as the migrations continue across the country, you have, I don't know why they skipped over Illinois, but landed in Iowa at William Penn University in Oskaloosa, Central Normal in Nebraska, Friends University and Barclay College in Kansas, and then George Fox College University in Oregon at the end of the Oregon Trail, and Whittier College in Southern California. Go through Whittier, it's kind of like going through High Point. All the street names are Quaker. Mendenhalls and Newlands and all that stuff. And of course, both of those colleges produced future Quaker presidents. George Fox was Pacific Academy, Herbert Hoover, Whittier, Richard Nixon. We're so proud. But anyway, education was very, very important. Simplifying the calendar. It's interesting, again in Europe, you got all these holidays, various and sundry saints' days and holidays. Quakers viewed every day as a holy day. And originally, would not, like Puritans, wouldn't celebrate Christmas or Easter. Every day should be a day when you observe the resurrection of that light of Christ. Every day should be a day when you observe the birth of that light in your life. Most Quakers now just certainly observe Christmas and Easter. You have to. Cadbury cream eggs. I mean, you have to. But, I grew up having never heard of Advent. I never heard of Lent. Never heard of Shrove Tuesday. I had to get my pancakes otherwise. Ash Wednesday, Maundy, Thursday, clueless. But simplification of that calendar. Integrity in the marketplace. This is a key concept of friends because Quakers believe in integrity. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. That's why you wouldn't swear an oath in court. Be honest, be truthful. And that applies to all these merchants. And Quakers had to go into merchandising because they weren't allowed as nonconformists into the proper occupations, doctors and lawyers and such. Couldn't go to Oxford, Cambridge.